doctor, what is a near-death experience?
Near-death experiences happen to people who are clinically dead, people whose hearts have stopped beating, their eyes are fixed and dilated, and yet they're resuscitated by medical technology. So they've been to the brink of death,
right,
and then resuscitated by our medical technology.
How do you know that when they have these experiences, and they say they've seen something, in other words, they come back
what
and
they say is extraordinary. They say that at the time, like Crystal, who I resuscitated myself, who was without a heartbeat for 19 minutes, she says that during that time she floated out of her body. She could see everything I was doing to her. I saw you put a tube in my nose, she told me. And then they say that they go down a dark tunnel to a heavenly realm, a place that's beautiful and bright and loving. One boy said to me, there was a lot of good things in that light. So it's a place of love for them.
How do you know induced by drugs and medication?
You know, Jonah, I'm a pediatrician. I studied these experiences for 8 years at Seattle Children's Hospital. And I studied hundreds and hundreds of children who were treated with drugs and who had a lack of oxygen to their brain, but were not near death. Not one of those children had this experience. Only children who come to the brink of death, who are clinically dead, have this experience. So it's not something caused by drugs. It's not some sort of hallucination.
How young was the youngest that you spoke to that could describe this to you?
The youngest child I've ever interviewed was a child who was age 3 or 4 who had this experience at 9 months of age.
And could remember it that clearly?
As clear as you and I are talking here, who said well, it's interesting the way it came up. His parents took him to a Christmas pageant, and he started screaming and crying and saying, that's not Jesus, because he felt he had seen Jesus as part of his near-death experience. Now, they don't all see Jesus. You know, each one sees...
Because if you have a different religion, you know, what if you're a Buddhist child?
Oh, then they see Buddhist religious figures. Or one child that I spoke with didn't have any religious training, so she told me that doctors dressed in white came to her. And I said, well, how did you know there were doctors? She said, well, they were all dressed in white, and they had light bulbs in their bodies.
They were glowing.
They were glowing. So, you know, she called them doctors, but a religious child would call them, you know, whatever.
Jesus or God.
Or whatever. These are not particularly religious experiences. They're spiritual experiences that happen to people when they die.
Another of the several hundred children Mel Morse has interviewed is 15-year-old Chris, who nearly died of a bronchial infection and saw her grandparents in a great white light.
And she was telling me that it's your choice to make. No one can make that choice. And if you want to stay here with us, you're welcome. If you want to go back, there are others calling and waiting for you. Go back. You're welcome to go back, but make your choice. It's up to you.
Morse believes that the fact that children, some of whom are just toddlers, are having these experiences is as close to proof of life after death as spiritual proof gets.
They're so matter-of-fact about it. They're just, you know, they're obviously, they have no secondary gain. You know, they're not going to be on a talk show. They're not going to write a best-selling book about it. They have no reason to invent the story. They just, if anything, they have reason to not tell the story because they think that they'll be laughed at. They think they're crazy. When you've had a child condescendingly pat you on the hand and say, you'll see, Dr. Morse, heaven is fun, you know, like I have, you tend to pay a lot more attention to these experiences. But I see our society as having a deep spiritual craving for this kind of information. Every time I interview someone, it just gives me chills. I go, it must be true.
They had bad experiences, doctor. Does any child come back? If a really rotten child comes back and says, uh-oh, I better straighten up here because it's warm and that man was not friendly.
I've interviewed dozens and dozens and dozens of children who've had this experience. I've never heard a negative or unpleasant experience. Adults frequently do, but not children. You know, I've just got to tell you one thing is that one girl told me life is for living and this light is for later. And these children, although they have no fear of death, they have an extraordinary vigor and love of life.
And when you came out of it and you tried to explain what happened to you, did people believe you? Did your friends believe you? Did your parents, the doctors, the nurses?
Well, really, I think it depends what kind of a family you're from. I told my mom, at first she thought she told me, she said, "What movies have you been watching, Crystal?" Yeah, or so like that. But after I kept telling her, she told me that after a 7-year-old tells you these things time and time over again with every detail, you can't help but believe it.
What about you? Do they believe you, the kids in school?
The people do it. Originally, I didn't tell anyone because the doctors and nurse didn't even believe I was sick when I was in the hospital. They told me I was overreacting. And so when I came to, they told me I was just hallucinating. And to me, that was such a special event, and I wanted to believe it was true. Right. So I never told anyone until a while later. I told a friend.
How did you find out from these children? Do you ask them, or do they just volunteer it to you?
These are not volunteers. I studied near-death experiences in children for 8 years, and I systematically interviewed every survivor of cardiac arrest at Seattle Children's Hospital. So these are children, I went to them and said, do you remember anything about the time that you were, asleep or unconscious or whatever? But no, these aren't volunteers that have come to me saying, oh, I've got a wacky story to tell you. Not at all. In fact, half of the children I talked to had never even told their parents about the experience.
So you spoke to them. Well, the book is fascinating, and it's very comforting also, and I'm glad you came back for whatever reason you came back. It's nice to have you two here. And I thank you so much. The book is called Close to Life.